Hi everyone and welcome back to the Minotaurium. My name is Torben and today I'm going to show you how I painted this Ghoul friend, which you can see spinning here before you, and will take you along for a harrowing experience involving thick washes and thin paints. And let's start by quickly mentioning the figure itself, which I kitbashed by taking the arms and body from the Goblin Slaves kit by North Star Miniatures and added a head from the Blood Oath Irish kit from Wargames Atlantic. I started from a normal black undercoat and then proceeded to base coat the tunic of the Ghoul in dark grey blue from Pro Acryl, making sure to get it all over and not really have a care for how messy I'm being at this point. I chose this blue because most of my undead armies are in variations of dark blues and purples, and while I didn't have an immediate spot for him in my armies, I might as well future-proof him. Having established a baseline color, I then decided to try using the bright brown grey color that I recently picked up from Pro Acryl's AMP line of paints, or maybe it's AMP's line of Pro Acryl paints. Either way, I wanted to try it as the underlying base color for really pale and definitely not healthy looking skin color. Alas, this paint, unlike most of Pro Acryl's lineup, was a bit too thin to my liking, so I struggled a bit to get a good coverage. Not the end of the world, of course, but seeing as this is basically the underlying base coat to help establish the actual base coat, I was a bit annoyed at it taking so much time. Once the layer was opaque enough to my liking, I then picked up some of the reformulated Vallejo game color Earth and gave a liberal coat of it around the feet wraps and the belt around his waist. Again, just as an underlying base color, because later we'll go over these wraps with an even lighter color still. And rather than working that up from black, an intermittent layer of somewhat lighter color makes my work that much easier. For the pelt, I decided to try out Boot Brown from Army Painter's new line of historical paints, but really any dark and reddish brown will do the same trick. So just thin it down a bit, as Army Painter's new Fanatic line is a bit thick, and get a good covering coat all over the pelt. I then, for some reason, decided to paint the hair in a dark ivory from Pro Acryl, as I had in mind some kind of wispy white hair for the figure, but the further the paint job came along, the less and less I liked the idea. Oh, and don't forget, as I just did, to add a bit of beige brown from William Model color to the hilt of the dagger. So that's all of the base coloring done for our undead Matthew McConaughey here, so let's begin adding in some contrast and details. I started to apply some medium blue from Vallejo model color to the tunic, thinking that it would be a good highlight color for the dark grey blue. And then I began to stipple it across the tunic with a slight stabbing motion, leaving some of the base color showing here and there. As always, be sure to avoid the deeper recesses when you start applying your highlight colors, and then just stipple the color on, leaving little gaps here and there. To further aid in this, be sure to thin the paint just a tad bit more than you'd normally thin it. Don't worry too much about it, just stab away at the tunic until you're happy with it. Now, if you're following along, this might seem a bit too stark of a blue at this point. At least that's what I felt, so I decided to add a glaze to it by mixing 1 drop of blue tone from Army Painter with 2 drops of the speed paint medium. This was then applied liberally all over the tunic and left to fully dry before I continued to add a further mix of 1 drop speed paint medium to 1 drop of Tempest Blue Wash from 2 thin coats to shift the blue tone ever so slightly darker. Painting, to me, is always about going back and forth like this, adjusting stuff until you're satisfied with the outcome, or you dump it in the paint stripper. Anyway, now that I'm more happy about the blue, I start to tackle the fur around the neck and shoulders by giving it a light overbrushing of Rifle Brown by Army Painter to separate the strands of hair a bit from the darker color below. I then painted some light battle dress from Army Painter as a rough highlight to the foot straps, where I tried to avoid the recesses but wasn't overly fussed if I hit some of them, as I was going to give all of it a big wash in just a second. And for that wash, I am using a 3:1 ratio of Voodoo Shade and Speed Paint Medium from Army Painter, and then applying a good and covering coat across the fur, the foot straps, the belt, and the hilt of the weapon. I tend to add 1 or 2 drops of Speed Paint Medium to all of my Army Painter washes, as I often find they either dry a bit too satin or just need a bit of extra medium to improve the flow. While this wash was drying, I add a bit of smoke grey wash from 2 thin coats to the hair before I then proceed to pick out the raised areas of the skin with the ivory tusk paint, which in hindsight was a bit too bright for what I had in mind. I tried to leave most of the deep recesses of the skin in the beige grey from earlier, but didn't worry too much about it, as I had a plan to add an all-over wash of magenta from Pro Acryl's AMP line to cover up all of the skin, which ended in a bit of a disaster. The wash was a gloppy mess and would not flow at all, but behaved more like some weird thin paint. I quickly loaded my brush with a good helping of water and proceeded to water down and thin out the wash on the figure, and then push the color to the recesses where I wanted it to pool. Now, this went by too fast to give you any ratio, but I then started to fill my brush with water before dipping it in the wash on my palette to help thin it out ever so slightly and make it flow better, and gave all of the skin an overall wash. When it was all dry, I then used the ivory tusk color from earlier to highlight the skin, leaving a good amount of the previous color in the recess, trying to aim for all of the places where your eyes are naturally drawn towards the figure. So areas like the knees, the elbows, the knuckles, and of course the face and the nose. I didn't go overboard here, but just used the base color to re-establish some further contrast on the skin. So not only did the magenta wash misbehave, it was also a lot warmer in tone than I remembered. That's okay. I whipped up a 3-to-1 mix of speed paint medium to blue tone and gave the skin a couple of coats of this. The glaze is just to tint the color towards a more cold and dead skin tone, and I had to give it 2 coats of this glaze in some areas to really shift it. As always, better to make the glaze too thin and use multiple coats than too thick and watch all of your hard work get covered up. Following this harrowing brush with disaster, I then took a bit of rifle brown and just painted some individual strands of hair on the fur to give them a bit more contrast. I then increased this contrast by applying some Camo Brown from Army Painter and then mixed in some of the light battle dress to lighten the color even more, roughly a 50-50 mix, and making sure to leave some of the darker colors still showing. Because I was still back and forth on it, I decided to add a bit of Voodoo Shade to the fur to boost its contrast a bit more, and this time without any dilution. While all of the wets were drying, I also gave the footwear a quick pass with some highlights of light battle dress, being sure not to hit any of the recesses, but not being so meticulous so as to highlight every single strap. After all, nobody's going to look at the feet of your figure unless they're kinda weird or you have entered it into a painting competition. I left it all to dry before proceeding to the final stage of highlights, metallics, and weathering. Beginning with the medium blue from earlier, I added a few edge highlights to some select areas, such as along the sleeves, any prominent folds on the bottom of the tunic, in order to further accentuate shadow for it. Then the haft of the dagger was given a quick highlight of beige brown, and then a bit of white star from 2 thin coats was painted along the strands of hair on top of the head, and then I started to add steel to all of the metal parts, which is basically gunmetal from Army Painter. When it was dry, I added some Grimdark Shadow wash to all of the metal parts, which I didn't thin down either because when it comes to metallic colors, I kinda like for the washes to have a bit of a satin sheen to it. Anyway, this was slathered all over the parts, and while it was drying, I added a very thin line of it along the edge of the fur to just further boost the separation between fur and tunic. Once the wash had completely dried, I mixed up some rust effect paint from Army Painter with a bit of water, around 2 parts water to 1 part rust, and proceeded to stipple this onto the metal using the stabbing-like motions from before. However, this time around I tried to stab in the middle as much as possible, so as to concentrate the effect there, and less on the edges of the metallic, adjusting as needed while it was still wet by using a worn brush and just pushing the paint away from the edges. Before it had dried fully, I grabbed a bit of steel and highlighted the edge of the dagger and the cuffs with some small stripes of metal to help sell the idea of this being rusted metal. To accentuate the sharp edge of the dagger, it's a good idea to draw your brush towards the edge of the blade, using small, sharp lines very close to each other, rather than going inwards, as you might end up removing too much of the rendering you've already made. For final touch, I gave the blade a quick edge highlight of aluminium from AK Interactive's line of marker colors. Then, I finally decided to give the hair a coat of occultist cloak speed paint to make it dark. Look, I have no idea why I kept that white for this long, but at least now it is fixed. The base was done by using a good dollop of dark earth texture paint from AK Interactive, which I then dry brushed with some British Uniform base, followed by a lighter dry brush of British Uniform light from AK Interactive, before finally doing a victory lap around the base rim using a Molotov black marker. And there we have it. The full blow-by-blow of my experience of painting this little ghoul, and I hope that there was something useful in it for you as well. It felt good to get back and make a video of how I painted things, but I'm still figuring out how I want to approach it. This time around, I wanted to make it less of a recipe or tutorial and more of a showcase of my process when I'm painting things for myself, without having to think about it becoming a tutorial. So if you have any feedback for this format, I'd be more than happy to read them in the comments below. So until next time, thank you for watching.